People have used herbalism and herbal medicine for thousands of years. So why do so many people think it doesn't work? Well, today I'm going to talk about the truth behind herbalism and herbal medicine. Hi, I'm the Herb Guy, and welcome to the Where Science Meets Nature podcast, a place where we explore the power of nature through the lens of science. This is episode 6, I think, and today we're going to talk about herbal medicine and herbalism, because there's a lot of misconceptions about it. Now, to be fair, when you look at me, I am a certified holistic and integrated health specialist, which is a lot of words, and when I tell people that, they just kind of look at me blankly, and they nod and blink, and oh, well, that's really interesting, but it's not really interesting because it sounds like a lot of nonsense, to be fair. So it's a lot easier for me to say herbalist, and to be honest, that is where a majority of my experience lies. I am very well aware of other modalities of healing. I have a certification in another form of healing, but for the most part, I'm just an herbalist, and I like to talk about herbalism and herbal medicine. The downside to it is the average person doesn't think any of that stuff works. Like, as far as they're concerned, those are just folk remedies. Those are things that are just to be kind of poo-pooed and not really taken as something that's serious. So, even though I'm an herbalist and they find it interesting at first, they don't necessarily know what it's all about, right? And part of the issue is, most people don't think that there's any type of science in herbalism. And maybe this could help clear up the misconception a little bit. Maybe if you stop thinking of it as herbalism, you can look at it as plant-based medicine, or phytotherapy is the actual technical term for it, which is literally translates to plant-based therapy. And this is where you're using the plants as medicine. Now, if you look at it logically, what is a plant? Well, a plant is really only 3 things. If you look at it, just the bare basics, right? It's going to be water, right? Most of it's going to be water. Usually 80 to 90% of the plant is going to be water. And then it's going to be fiber, and that fiber is where you get your, the stems and the leaves. You can kind of see the fibers in there. And then, of course, there's chemicals, because each individual chemical is what makes up the plant. So, each plant has its own specific blend of chemicals that makes it unique, and which is what makes it that plant. And if you can think about it that way, and if you look at plants as nothing but like little chemical balloons, it might make it a little bit easier to understand more about herbal medicine, okay? And I try to keep this as simple as possible. What most people don't realize is up until about 1906, kind of more cemented at around 1910, herbal medicine really became obsolete. And the AMA actually had a lot to do with that. It really wasn't, a lot of people think it was big pharma, but back then it really wasn't big pharma. Back then it was little pharma. They didn't have nearly the influence. They weren't given nearly as much money to the government. They were just simply trying to make money, obviously, which is why they started switching to synthetics, because it was discovered that they couldn't patent the plants. Okay. So Bayer was the first to figure this out, and that's kind of where the science diverged. It's not exactly when, but it's kind of where. And for the most part, though, all of our medicine up until that point was made from plants. Now, I can prove this. It's not just, I'm just saying that, that I have old books that were used back in that day. I have one in particular called the Materia Medica Pharmacy and Therapeutics, and I'll actually be reading some stuff out of that today. Now, this is from 1899, and what this was the medical reference book of its time. If you were a doctor, or if you were a pharmacist, or if you were a therapeutist back then, which would be your doctor today, that was somebody who actually did the diagnoses and tried to figure out what was wrong. And of course, if you were one of those old rural country doctors, well, you were all of it. You were also the pharmacist. You were also the doctor. You did all of that. And so, but back then they had the concept down right. They knew exactly where they were at with it. And here's where I can tell you that we really based our initial health care on finding cures, right? This book talked about cures, trying to find cures and curing things. It didn't talk about giving you a better quality of life. It didn't talk about just making things a little better for you. It talked about cures. So I want to read one of the first things that's in the book, and it's kind of old wordy, right? Again, it's from 1899. But they talk about different forms of therapeutics or different forms of therapies that they had back then. And the very first one that he discusses, the book was written by a Dr. Potter, Dr. O.S. Potter, I think his name was. And he wasn't some crackpot guy. He was a legitimate doctor, right? He wrote the Materia Medica. He also wrote several other textbooks, like, for instance, he wrote the college anatomy textbook, right? This was a very renowned doctor. So he talked about the different types of therapeutics. And the one that really catches my eye, because I am an herbalist, is natural therapeutics. And here's what they believed in 1899, and I'm going to read it verbatim. There is no scientific dogma better established than this, that the living organism is in itself adequate to the cure of all of its curable diseases. Now that, I mean, it sounds like a lot of word salad, but what they believed back then was that the body itself had the ability to heal itself, right? They believed that, and you heard it in just the first few words of the sentence. There is no scientific dogma better established. That was what they, according to them, to the science in 1899, the body was fully able to heal itself, right? Now humans as a species, I don't know that we're necessarily there yet, because you really have to believe that you're going to get better. You have to have that presumption that you're going to get better before you can start the curing or the healing process. So I think that, the placebo effect is a really good way to explain that, right? Because clearly it wasn't the sugar pill that cured them, okay? It was their belief that the sugar pill that they were taking was the actual medication, and that's what cured the illness. And in those cases, if you actually go back and read a lot of those studies, they were cured, right? It didn't just make them better temporarily. It cured them. It fixed them, because in their mind, they believed that was what was going to happen. They're just going to be cured. So, I mean, when it comes to that, is that the ideal way of doing it? Sure. No big pharma needed, no herbalists needed, no doctors, other than if you get like an injury or something like that needs like an acute attention. But for the most part, you don't really need any of that, right? Because you can do it naturally. However, it doesn't work that way. I mean, it can, but it just doesn't. We're not there yet. So we have to rely on herbs, right? Nowadays, we tend to lean more towards pharmaceuticals, but if you look at the math behind it, about 68% of all pharmaceuticals are made from a plant. They're either made directly from or they're derived from, okay? So in some cases, they'll actually just pull the chemical compounds out of the plant. And some of those medicines that are used today are in this book from 1899. They still use them today. Like, if you've ever seen the plant, the foxglove plant, okay? It's a really beautiful flower. I really love the foxglove. It's great. However, you probably don't want to sit and have a cup of foxglove tea, right? Right? It does have a specific cardiac function. It will impact your heart. But today, they still use the foxglove. Even today, they use the foxglove plant in order to make medicine that's called digoxin. If you've ever had any type of heart condition, at the very least, you've probably heard of it. Now, it is one of the more popular heart drugs because it makes the heartbeat stronger, right? It actually helps to tone the heart itself. Has some other functions, but digoxin in and of itself is kind of dangerous, right? It's not the easiest plant to use. So, but they still use it today. They still use it, and they derive digitalis from it. Now, one of the other plants that they use, you may have heard of this, is called star anise. If you've never heard of it, go ahead and look it up. Just look up star anise, A-N-I-S-E, star anise. Now, that's a member of the pine family, okay? And those little star-shaped pods that you see that the star anise drops are actually kind of like pine cones. It's not really directly a pine, but it's really closely related in the family. And you can tell that it's closely related because it shares a lot of the same chemical compounds that the pine has. Like it has shikimic acid. Shikimic acid is, and they still use it today, they extract the shikimic acid from the star anise, and they're using that to make Tamiflu. Tamiflu is a pretty popular prescription that's given for taking care of flu symptoms because of the ability of the shikimic acid to stop the virus from replicating. It helps to prevent the virus from actually attaching to the cells. There's a lot of benefits for it. But they don't, but they're using an herb to do it. And a lot of people don't realize that. They don't realize that we use so many different tools or we use so many different plants as far as our pharmaceuticals. And I think that maybe part of the process that we should do is to rethink how we think about this herbal medicine and think about maybe looking a little bit deeper into it. And one of the differences about herbal medicine, I mean one of the key differences is that by using the herbs themselves, they tend to have no side effects, or at the very least few side effects. You might get the runs here and there, or you might have an allergic reaction possibly. In some cases, some of the herbs you can have an allergic reaction, and that can be a problem, right? You don't want to swell up with hives. But I mean, when it comes to that, there's less side effect. You have less to worry about when you're taking the herbs. But in reality, the main goal shouldn't be to just continue to have to take herbs or take plants or phytotherapy type supplements. The main goal should be, in theory, to get yourself all better, right? Fix the root cause, and that's where herbs come in handy, because when you look at herbs, we have thousands of years of evidence based information in regards to herbal medicine. Hippocrates talked about it back then. Traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, which is from India, and it's focused mainly on the patient. And it's this is stuff we've had this information for thousands of years. Now, part of the problem, especially back in 1899, is we didn't necessarily have the internet to do our research on, so it was very slow and tedious. And a lot of the plants that we had studied, as far as these books go, were plants that were pretty native to Europe. Sometimes you'd get some from Asia, but it wasn't as easy as it is today to have access to all of those plants. Okay, like in the Materia Medica, I think they had one from South America, but for the most part, a majority of the herbs were either found here fairly locally, or they were herbs that were used in Europe and were very well tested. Like, one of the oldest companies in the world is a pharmaceutical company in Germany. I don't remember the name offhand, but they've been around since 1650. So they've been doing the research on these plants for hundreds of years, and it was a pharmaceutical company. And even though their science may not be what you would call up to today's standards as far as science goes, they were as scientific as they could be at the time. They would have been fairly advanced. They were a pharmaceutical company. They were a company. Actually, they started as an apothecary, a little herb shop. But, it kind of stands to be the same thing. They just evolved over time, and now they're a pharmaceutical company. But, I'm sure they haven't forgotten their roots, considering, again, 68% of drugs are made from a plant. So changing our mindset would certainly be helpful. And I think that we gotta kind of address the misconceptions about it when they say there isn't a lot of research. There are literally like libraries full. Like you could fill up libraries with all the research that's been done on herbal medicine. And I'm not talking about the stuff from thousands of years ago. I'm saying like within the last 100 years. The science that's been done within the last 100 years has been very extensive. There's tens of thousands of studies. And all of those, or at least a huge majority of those, have been on how plants and phytochemicals, or plant-based chemicals, can be applied medicinally. How are they going to use them medicinally? And they tend to try to break it down by constituent, by simple compound, because it's so much easier to patent that compound. And in some cases, they can not only break down the compound, but they can synthesize it. Easy for me to say. They can synthesize that, and that makes it a man-made. Oftentimes, it's cheaper. If you hear a lot of the people that are really against big pharma, they're going to jump and say, "Oh yeah, the Rockefellers put their petrochemicals in it." And to be fair, I mean, some pharmaceuticals do. Not all of them. Not all of them are loaded with petrochemicals as the anti-Rockefeller people really want to claim. But I don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of that dude either. But I'm not quite the fanatic as all that. I don't think he's necessarily the reason for all the woes. He just took advantage of a really good situation. It was right around that time, 1906, 1910, that he really started to make that push. And did he dip his toe in? Sure, a little bit. But he wasn't like a driving force or a driving factor. Those companies were trying to do that long before that dude came along, right? So they were still trying to do that stuff. He just said, "Heck, man, it's just a means for me to make more money," and he did, right? I'm not gonna downplay his role, but I'm not gonna make him the ultimate villain in that whole process either. So, so around 1910, that's when they started really changing terminology, and they've been doing it for the last 115 years, right? They've been continuing that trend. So anytime you say herbal remedy or holistic health or any type of modality that does not conform with the AMA, and the AMA was the driving factor behind that. And even though I wasn't there for it, it kind of seems to me like the pharmaceutical companies first went to the AMA, okay, and they said, "Hey, man, if you start promoting these things we're making, the things that we're making for better health for people, we'll give you a little bit of a cut." And of course the AMA is like, "Man, I like money," and they had some influence. They were the driving factor. They were the ones that they were essentially just a union back in the time, but they were the ones that made you a doctor or not, right? If you weren't AMA approved, you weren't a doctor. So not an official doctor anyway. And then that continued. That was back in the 1850s when the Journal of the American Medical Association first started. Now they're just the AMA, and I'm sure you've heard of them. They own WebMD. They run WebMD. So if you look up herbal remedies on WebMD, they're always going to tell you, at least a huge majority of the time, they're going to tell you more research is needed. There's not enough scientific data to back it. And all of that stuff started back in about 1910, where they said, well, and to be fair, they kind of had some reason to do it. You had a bunch of those snake oil salesman guys running around, the creepy dude in the wagon that came through with his bottle of oil that fixed everything. And those guys obviously were just out for money, and they did no good. They didn't do any good. Oftentimes those things were just loaded with opium and alcohol. So the people were so sick that by the time he left town, he was already out of town and made his money, and he just left a bunch of sick people behind him. So yeah, there was some legitimate concern for that. But there was also a means for the new and emerging little pharma to make more money, and for the people, the representatives of the AMA to make more money. So they started to vilify the term, right? They turned to label them as quacks. They did everything they could to discredit them, while simultaneously trying to buy the patents for things that did work, right? So, they weren't, even at that time, they weren't necessarily worried about the customer. They did want to cure things. They wanted to fix the patient so the patient didn't have to come back. And now that's been turned into more of a revolving door, okay? So, in 1910, when they passed or 1906, they passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? That was when labeling started started doing its thing, and you weren't able to make claims that weren't scientifically proven. And of course, who did the approval? Well, the AMA, of course. So, and as they were trying to discredit herbal medicine at this time, like 1899, this Materia Medica that I have, the reason why I have it is because I know that there's going to be plants and plant-based medicine in here, and they're going to discuss how to use it, how to break it down, proper dosing. That's going to give you the real raw information. And it can't be altered, right? It's not like they can go back through the memory banks and alter it. It's pure. It's on paper. So you have that information. So with the Pure Food and Drug Act, they typically speaking, the herbal remedies would have like these broad claims of things they could do. Again, that's part of the snake oil part, right? Don't necessarily agree with that. But they had to be more transparent with their contents. Like you couldn't just say, "Oh, it's a diverse blend." You had to put the blend in there and say what was in there. So back in those times, people were fairly uneducated. Not a lot of the population could read, so they would put the Latin name on there, and make it more difficult for people to know what's in it. And of course, they would just kind of, the enforcement really wasn't. It was kind of hard to enforce. It wasn't like you could just look on the internet and find it. So, it was limited. So a lot of the herbs were still used freely. But if you were a doctor, like let's say you've been a doctor for 30 years, and in 1906, when they passed the Flexner Report, then if you were a doctor, then even if you've been a practicing doctor for 30 years, if you didn't toe the line and fall into what they were starting to do now, which would have been to evolve away from herbal medicine, because it was trying to be changed, right? These pharmaceutical companies were now starting to lobby the politicians and really try to vilify the whole herbal medicine or using herbs as medicine and make it as secretive as possible. So the Flexner Report came out, and this was funded by the Carnegie Foundation. And what it did was it kind of streamlined medical education in the U.S. and Canada, and it changed it because what the report did is it criticized medical schools. Like if you were a medical school and you were still teaching the old way, from the materia medica, if you were teaching the herbal part of it, then you were discredited. They would remove your accreditation, so you wouldn't, so if somebody graduated, they couldn't be called a doctor because they weren't accredited anymore. Just simply because they were teaching that maybe the pharmaceutical method wasn't the best method. Let's stick with what we've been doing for the last 300 years. Okay. So they started to discredit the schools, and of course, the schools, you lose your patients or you lose your students, you're no longer in business. Those schools kind of started falling in line. They were either forced to close, right, or they were forced to evolve their curriculum, and of course that curriculum was approved only by the AMA, and of course the AMA was now being directly funded, or at least had a lot of money going to it from the pharmaceutical industry, which was now starting to become more big pharma. Because think about it, this would be the time when you're consolidating things. Now you're going to start vilifying herbal medicine. You're going to start debating the science, because they would say things like, well, there hasn't been enough testing. It's like, well, just last year you were using the materia medica to do the exact thing you needed to do to get the extract for proper dosing. Now all of a sudden it's not accurate, and they're like, well, with plants they're not going to necessarily be the same thing. And it's like, well, that's what makes each plant specific, is the specific chemical compounds in that plant. So even if that plant has some different growing conditions, or the soil is a little bit different, the main constituents of the plant are going to be the same. They're going to still be mostly consistent, right? And it worked back then. And they didn't have all the chronic illness, right? They weren't doing processed foods. They people were making meals. People were eating proper meals. And, for the most part, they were significantly healthier. So, but, that was around this time, was also around the time when they started to make processed food. So people were kind of starting to get a little ill, and at the very least they were kind of focusing, or at least trying to stay away from cures, and more along the lines of trying to do treatments, right? And from a business perspective, it makes more sense to create customers and not cures. If you make a cure, they don't want to ever come back ever, right? Because you made a cure. But if you make a treatment that is required of them to have to do the same thing every single month, because if you don't, you could get even more seriously ill or whatever. And so the treatment wasn't necessarily the best option either. And I just, it boggles the mind, but I can understand how they were able to kind of take control of everything, okay? By first money, of course. And, and they did it the right way. They started with the American Medical Association, which was the doctors' union. And then they switched it up to politicians and started greasing those wheels a little bit. And then the next thing you know, herbal medicine came out of fashion. Poof, just like that. And it didn't really take all that long. Now, they had other things that they had for healing as well. It wasn't just about herbs. They debunked everything. Anything that disagreed with their narrative, they debunked it. And the reason why, what they would do is they would go through and they would find people that had things like inventions. So let's talk about Royal Raymond Rife. Okay, he had developed a machine. He was the original. You may have heard right now about frequency healing and things like that. He was the one who initially developed that, and I mean, he was going like crazy. He was very, very successful. There was 12 different doctors that was using his machine, and even though the end results kind of varied by doctor, for the most part there was mostly positive. I would say probably 80-90% success rate. And so there was a guy that his name was Fishbein, Morris. I think his name was Morris Fishbein, back in like the early 20s. And he went to Rife and he's like, "Hey man, kind of want to buy that patent." And Rife's like, "No, I think I'm good." And so, he went back a few times. He tried to buy the patent from Rife, and Rife turned him down every time. And he eventually, the Fishbein came out and said, "Oh man, that guy's a quack, and his stuff is junk." And he went to jail. He was persecuted by other people that were doing it. And even though the doctors were still using his machine to success, they were doing everything they could to discredit him personally. Right, a natural way to heal. And well, maybe not natural, but he was just using frequencies, right? There's no prescription needed, and he was able to demonstrate that he could kill specific organisms with this frequency. And this kind of proves out, because even today's, like within the last 10-15 years, they've discovered, quote unquote discovered, that frequencies have the ability to take care of certain cancers or different kinds of organisms, because those organisms just don't have the ability to function or live or even stay structurally sound under certain frequencies. Okay, and so Rife had it back then, but they discredited him, and he ended up a lot like Tesla. He ended up broke and destitute when he died. He was, and all because this guy Fishbein did everything he could to discredit him, and that dude was a piece of work. Fishbein was not a good guy. He did that a lot with a lot of herbal stuff. There were other things that he did that other people, I guess, that he went after. He went after. You can look these up. These are kind of fun, and I've kind of looked at them. And it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder how many other things that could have worked. There's Renee Casey's Giesiak. He didn't go after her, but that's just one example of one that showed great potential against cancer. And somebody else that was persecuted, but I'll cover Renee Casey later. As far as Fishbein goes, there was Harry Hoxie's Herbal Remedy. He was a guy that had his own herbal, and I guess when he went to court, a lot of people testified, how good it worked for him. But Fishbein came after him several times to buy the patent. "I want to buy the patent for that." And he's like, "No, man, you can kiss off. I know, I'm good." And they did the same thing to him. I mean, he ended up suing Fishbein for libel, and he won. Now Fishbein, like in the 20s, got kind of booted out of the AMA because he was kind of running it like a dictator, and of course of tactics like that of trying to buy people's patents, and if they didn't sell, he would just discredit them, and ruin them. So segue 100 years later, they're still kind of doing the same thing, right? They still suppress information. There's people that still, come up with different blends and remedies, and the pharmaceutical companies, even when it's discovered that it works for this or that. I've seen ones where there's been treatment for cancers and treatment for other disorders, and the pharmaceutical companies will immediately try to buy the patent. And in some cases, some of those people do. They go, "Okay, yeah, I guess I'll buy it. I'll take that." And of course, that patent never sees the light of day. Never gets used, ever. Just kind of goes in some old storeroom somewhere, and never gets used. But that makes it more frustrating. And of course, the mainstream narrative, you get it from the government telling you, like the FDA telling you, "Oh man, you can't be listening or researching herbs, and they're bad for you." You get the AMA, your doctors, and now in some cases your doctors won't even treat you if they find out you're using any type of herbal supplement. They'll tell you, well, you either have to stop taking the supplement or I'm going to stop treating you. Which doesn't seem to be very helpful, right? And part of the reason why the doctors do that is they don't know. They haven't done the research on that. They don't know. They don't know what it's good for. How would they know? They haven't looked at it. So what do you need to know about how that works? You keep hearing everything is is bad for you. You keep hearing how terrible it is for you. You probably think, if unless you follow me already, you probably think that it's all just a bunch of hokey nonsense. And why would you even bother? I would rather just go take a pharmaceutical. But um, if you do a little bit of digging, a little bit of research, believe it or not, you're not stupid if you do your own research. You're actually, I would think you're a lot more intelligent if you're willing to take the time that it takes to do a little bit of research for your own health. And you should, if you think about it logically, you should take your own and do your own research. Why would you trust somebody else to to research your health? That's your health, right? And so what can you do? What can you do? You can learn. You can start small and you can learn, and you can start like one herb at a time. But you really got to find out what the science is behind it. And I can give you some tips on that, on how to find the science behind it. But there's also more to it than just knowing what an herb is good for. It's also how to use it. What are the most effective ways to use it? Because there's different ways of doing that too. And again, a lot of herbalists and obviously nobody in the mainstream aren't going to necessarily break that down for you all the way to show you how to apply them to your life. A lot of them will. A lot of them are more of a health coach, and they're going to kind of guide you and direct you. But for the most part, people are in business to make money. Herbalists are people too, and they are in business. It doesn't, am I saying they're not trying to help you? Absolutely not. That's not even close to what I'm saying. But they're going to approach it with what they're taught, and they're typically taught to use one use herbs, and they're typically taught that that you go after the symptoms, right? If you go to, like, I guess Cornell University has an herbal class, and I've studied other herbal classes, and every single one of them breaks down herbs individually, like I do. I do tell you the bare basics of what an herb is good for, but they tell you how to use it for specific conditions, right? In phytotherapy, when you're learning about using herbal medicine, but they still do the one-off, man, one herb, just use one herb, and it's never made a lot of sense, and it's not really complicated, right? A lot of the plants that you have just right around your feet are medicinal. Everything, almost everything, even poison ivy has medicinal properties, and it's in this book, the Materia Medica, talks about the medicinal properties of poison ivy. And if we can change our mindset, if you can change the way you look at plants, if you go outside and you look in your yard, you might see grass, but there's typically speaking, unless you're one of those kind of people that sprays the heck out of it, and you don't have anything but grass in your yard, for the average person, there's lots of other plants. You go out there, I'd be willing to bet if you go out in your backyard and you look, take 2 or 3 steps off your porch or whatever, and just do a quick circle around and look at everything in your yard, be willing to bet, unless you are one of those, yard freaks that has to keep that perfectly manicured yard, you'll find a minimum of 4 or 5 different plants mixed in with the grass, and every one of those plants has medicinal properties. And that's what we've forgotten. This is the truth about herbal medicine, that your medicine cabinet literally grows all around you. It's you're surrounded by it. Trees, bushes, the leaves, the dandelions, in some cases the fungi, the stuff under the ground. I mean, it's all there. That's where it's all at. And we used to know thousands of years ago how to use them and apply them. I mean, when a doctor back in the day, in 1899, when he was in a rural area and he had to ride his horse 10 miles to go help a patient, do you think he just helped her and then left and then hoped for her to come back again later so he could make that trek again? No. He showed her. He went there and he said, okay, this is the problem. It's addressed, or him, whatever, whoever it is the doctor was talking to. Here's the problem. Here's what we're going to give him for it. This is what you're going to look for. And he would either, make it show the people where it is locally. I mean, most of those plants grew right around us anyway. And then he would show them how to prepare it and how to use it, because he didn't want to have to come back. The whole point was to find a cure. And that's where herbalism's at. In reality, we're looking for a cure. But unfortunately, because of the FDA, we're just not allowed to tell you that. I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that any herbs are beneficial for you, right? I can't tell you what herb to take if you have a cold or a flu, and I can't tell you what herb could potentially help, your heart, or maybe boost your liver function. I can tell you about the science, but I can't make any steady claims. I can't say, this does this for sure. Even if I have the science to back it up, even if I have a dozen medical studies to back it up, the AMA doesn't approve it, and the FDA certainly does not approve it. So, don't think that just because it's a bunch of plants that there's not science behind it, because there's clearly a lot of science behind it. And also don't think that it wouldn't work for you, because realistically speaking, if it doesn't work for you, then you're one of the oddballs. You're the mutant at that point. Because why wouldn't it work for you? You're the only person that it didn't work for out of all these other people. 4,000 other people, you're the only one. So, is it the plant or is it the person? And I understand that every body is different, and what I mean by that is every space body is different, and each one's going to react a little bit differently. But when it comes to certain things like that, I tend to wonder whether it's just not the person. Um, and if you can get into the mindset of looking at plants not as just plants or a nuisance in your yard or flower bed or something you need to water on your counter, but look at the plants around you as your source of help, right? Start. If you're not sure where to start and you're looking to start, go outside, find the first plant you find, and identify it. Now, if you don't know how to identify it, I'm going to assume you have a phone. Most likely you're listening to me on a phone. If you have a phone, you can take a picture of it, and there's lots of different ways you can identify it. The Google Lens, I guess, does that now. If you have Google Lens or Android, they have different apps you can get. My favorite personal app for identifying in the wild, because it's mostly accurate and it's free, is an app called PlantNet. PlantNet. It's all one word. It's a free app. It doesn't cost you anything. You can sign up for it and get geolocation. And when you take certain pictures of a plant, you can actually add them to their collection and stuff. It's a pretty big network. It's pretty cool, and I like it. But there's other ones, Blossom, but that one charges. From what I understand, Snapchat can do that for you. And I'm sure there's other types of apps. You can just look it up. But I prefer PlantNet. That one, over the years, I've had more. I don't remember the names of them because they weren't as good as PlantNet. But I've had other types of plant identification apps, and PlantNet seems to be the one that I prefer. That's the one that seems to work the best. It's the most accurate, at least as far as the herbs that I find here locally. And I'm in Ohio. So PlantNet. So you go outside, you go in your backyard, and you identify an herb. Just identify it. Figure out what it is. Once you figured it out, you're going to walk back inside, because it's probably going to be cold out, especially if you're doing it right now. If it's not cold and you want to do it on your back porch, feel free. Do a quick Google search. Let's say you go outside and you see plantain. Your app, PlantNet, you've taken a picture of the leaf. It tells you it's plantain, Plantago major. And you're like, okay, so you're going to go inside or wherever you're going to sit, and you're going to do a Google search, and you're going to search medicinal properties of plantain. And a bunch of stuff will pop up. Now, most likely, some of those are going to be about the plantain fruit. So if you'd like to be more specific, do medicinal properties of plantain leaf. And that'll pop up. Now, if you go down, you'll see a lot of, like, herbalists that'll tell you all the stuff that it's good for. And I'm not saying that their information is wrong, but if you're looking for scientific information, if you're looking for that validity or the validation from science, keep scrolling down. Some of the good places to go, Medical News Today is a good one to go to, Healthline, other types of publications that do those types of remedies and stuff, and they'll usually say 12 best herbs for this, or 12 reasons why you should use fenugreek, or whatever, and you click on that, and that's where you're going to get to the science. Because you can't just go to NIH and do that anymore. They don't let you just go to NIH and look it up. What's this herb good for? What's that herb good for? Well, if you do that, if you go to NIH, they're just going to give you a bunch of products that have been approved by the FDA, or at least going through the approval process, that are made from that plant. But you're not going to get any of the studies that really are relevant and show you the plant itself. So you do your search, and you go to Healthline. Well, when you go to Healthline, they'll typically break up their articles into sections, like heart health, cholesterol health, mood health. And then you read that, and there'll usually be 2 or 3 links to actual medical studies. It'll be there. You're going to get to the NIH, but you're going to have to do it through the back door. That's the back doorway into the NIH. Now, once you open that study and you read all the medicinal properties of that plant, you're going to scroll down towards the bottom of that same study, and then you'll see links in that. And it's going to link to other studies that have been done about that plant. Usually it's going to be about that plant. So most of the information you'll see in there are other studies that have been done about that particular plant. And then you can open it up, and there's your rabbit hole. Now you can find all the medicinal properties. Now once you've exhausted those, you go back to Healthline again, and you go down to the next section of that plant. So, first one was heart, next one's cholesterol. Going to go read that study, and then go down that tree, rabbit hole of links to other studies. And that's the best way to learn an herb, if you're not going to go to a class or anything like that. And to be fair, you really should look at the science of it. Don't you think the science would be more valid if you can see numbers and from their tests, and you get to see real numbers and real information. It's not just oh well, I gave this to Jim and he feels better. Now they have they've done the blood work. So not only did Jim tell you he feels better, they have the blood work to prove it, right? Because the guy took this particular plant or herb. So if you stop thinking about herbs or plants as just folklore, or as just folk medicine, or as just not being medicinal enough, and start kind of gearing your thinking and learning each herb, the best bet would be to learn every herb locally. Every herb you have in your yard, start with that. When I was married a couple of years ago, go out in the backyard, I went through the property. There was like an acre, almost 2 acres of property. In that 2 acres of property, we had more than 50 medicinal plants and trees on just 2 acres. 50. Now all of them have a lot of science to back them up, and there will be some cases when you find some local stuff where you're not going to see a lot of scientific studies about it, but you will see a lot more of the herbalist. I hate to use the word anecdotal, because it's still, depending on how it's being observed and used, anecdotal can be just as relevant. I mean, how else are they supposed to get the information then from the patient? And anecdotal usually means that the patient told them this, but they don't have any real numbers to back it up. It's just what the patient said, anecdotal. So, you have to start changing your mindset, start doing your own research, and then you got to figure out why you want to, it's nice to know that you have them there, but do you really need to pick it? What medical condition you're trying to work at? Because at this point, what is it? I think 66% of the U.S. adult population is currently on some sort of pharmaceutical drug, or at the very least has been prescribed one in the last year, has used one in the last year. 66%. That's 2 out of 3 people. Imagine that. 2 out of 3 people over the age of 18 that you know personally, on average, I would say on average, 2 out of 3 of those people have some sort of pharmaceutical drug, or in the last year have used one. Unless you are in a very specific group of people that doesn't use that type of stuff. That's going to be pretty close to it. It's going to be roughly 2 out of 3 people. And those are terrible stats, man. That's awful. So, it'd be better if we switched it over more towards an herbal approach and a holistic approach, which is meaning more natural. But it's hard to change people's mindset. We've been brainwashed for 100 years to look at herbal remedies, herbal treatments, phytotherapy, plant-based medicine. We've been trained for over 100 years to look at that as nothing more than just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, right? There's nothing behind it that makes it relevant, and most people don't think it does. So it's up to you at this point now to start doing some of your own research, right? Start digging in and learn the plants around you. Don't just necessarily walk through your yard and think, oh, it's just a bunch of weeds. I mean, I guess technically they can be classified as weeds, but in reality, they're probably closer to a medicine cabinet, because each herb is going to have multiple benefits. They're not going to be good for just one thing. Not just good for your heart, but maybe also good for your lungs. Maybe not just good for diabetes management, but also good for your heart and good for balancing your cholesterol, all in one herb, on top of all the other benefits it has because of the different chemicals in it. And if you can change your mindset, stop thinking of plants as just plants and start thinking of them as chemicals, chemical balloons, it might help you be better able to steer yourself towards learning more about that kind of stuff. I've had a lot of people tell me Dude, you've changed the way I look at things. You've changed the way I look at things. I had one gentleman that has a lawn care service, and he's like, you completely changed the way I even approach my business now. Like he won't do full yard sprays. He's like, I don't do it anymore. I won't. They want it, they can get somebody else. I won't do it because of all the benefits in the yard. He goes, I encourage people to keep it naturally green, naturally healthy. So that's pretty cool. You know, so we're able to kind of turn the tide a little bit, and more people are becoming curious about it. Right? What's it all about? Well, it's all about that it works. And there's tons of science to back it up. It's also all about that it's pretty easy to learn. Right? It's not rocket science, even though there is a lot of science, um, but yeah, I mean that's right. That's my take on it. I'd love to hear what you think about it, but my take on it is herbal medicine is how we should be doing it. We did it for thousands of years, okay, and the only reason why we switched was because it was hard to patent a plant to make money. So, hopefully with this new incoming administration, it won't be such a burden and such a tedious thing of nonsense to worry about, because if he's going to be making, if RFK Jr. is going to be making the shakeup at the FDA that he claims he is, that's good news for people like me. I'm going to be better able to spread my message. People are going to be more apt to want to hear what I have to say, because the FDA isn't going to be there trying to demonize it all. But what do you think, though? I mean, do you think we're conditioned to think that herbal medicine doesn't work? Do you think that we're conditioned to believe that we should just listen to what people in lab coats say and not do our own research? Because, I mean, the more I see it and the more people I'm around that have that mentality, the more I'm beginning to think, it makes it a lot easier just to make everybody a pharmaceutical zombie. It's a lot easier to get them to do what you want. They're just a zombie for heaven's sake. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to think. Now, my next episode, depending on this one turns out, I haven't heard it on playback yet, but the first several tests that I did, it sounded good. So hopefully this sounds good. If it sounds good, make sure you let me know, or at least if it sounds better. Things are going to start steadily improve. I'm going to be starting a new YouTube channel where I'm going to be discussing single cooking for single people. That way you don't have to make big batches of things. You can just make single cooking. And hopefully it'll simplify the cooking process, and maybe some people will start or stop anyway trying to live out of a box. If that sounds like a type of group, it's going to be a separate channel. But if that sounds like a group of videos you'd want to see, simple cooking, single life cooking, I'm doing the video series either way. But I'd certainly love it if you guys would come over and join me there. Next week, on the next episode, episode 7, we're going to be breaking down the spice rack and all these, a lot of the benefits and some of the misconceptions about the spices in your spice rack. So I do appreciate if you made it all the way through this far to listen. If you do have any feedback, anything constructive that can make the podcast better, I very much appreciate it. Pretty soon, I do have a co-host coming in, and I think a lot of these conversations will flow a lot better. But I'd love to hear what you think of it tonight. I appreciate everybody watching. Have a great night.